Hello, everyone, and this is going to be Lost Gold to World War II, and I'm going to answer a few questions that are left unanswered from the show. So let's just get into it. So the last episode, they said Ferdinand Marcos confiscated all the maps. We're going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk to you about Nueva Vizcaya, because it is weird that they would go to Nueva Vizcaya without a map and without, well, they said there was no map last year. This year they're saying there are a map. So there's strange reasons, but I think I may have found out the reason. So let's just get into it. So, as I said, Bob Curtis was a member of the Lieber group. There were two members that were Filipinos that were involved in or reportedly involved in the burial of the gold. One was Leopold Giga. And he was actually imprisoned at Fort Santiago. Fort Santiago is in Intramuros. It was the Spanish part of the city, and area in that city is very Spanish, and all the buildings are Spanish oriented. And so during World War II, the Japanese used it as a prison camp. The dungeon, which is near the water, was actually where the diggings were, and that's where they held prisoners of war. Well, Giga was actually imprisoned there. The commander of the Japanese battalion there to watch over the prisoners of war actually had a Filipino instructor during one of his academies, which last name was Giga. I'll say Giga, we'll just call it that. And so he thought it was really odd that the name, so he contacted him, brought him up, and they were going to use slave labor like they always did to build machinery, weaponry, and loot gold and all that stuff. And so he wanted to know if he knew the instructor. Winds up that he was the nephew of his instructor. So he wound up being put on the staff of the Japanese officers' staff. And he could speak Japanese. So he was sent to Japan during the war to attend school on tunneling and inventorying the sites. Now, during the same time, 1942, in Nueva Vizcaya, that's where they are right now mining, Prince Chichubu met Ben Valmores. He was 14 at the time, and it wound up that Prince Chichubu needed a errand boy, or if that's what you want to call it. So Ben Valmores was chosen. So they traveled around. He traveled around with Chichubu and went to all the burial sites. He only watched them put in the crates, but he never helped them do it, so he had no idea about it. When Prince Chichubu left the Philippines, he entrusted Ben Valmores with all the maps. And Sterling Seagraves actually interviewed him and did a test where he put down pictures of different princes and different Japanese people and said, "Who's Chichubu?" And Ben Valmores picked him out and actually sang a song in Japanese, which wound up being the prince's favorite song. So he kind of proved that he knew who Prince Chichubu was. Let's just go back in time a little bit more. We're going to talk about Marcos now, and then we'll get back to Ben Valmores in a minute. In 1935, Marcos's father was a politician. His uncle was Pio. Now, Pio his uncle winds up being the judge who refused to sign off on Roger Rojas's treasure trove in the Baguio, and he actually told Marcos about it, and Judge Pio always made himself unavailable. In 1935, Pio and Marcos was charged with murder of a political opponent of Marcos's father, and this guy was actually shot in his house, and Marcos was tried and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But during the time in prison, he actually worked on becoming a lawyer. After the war, Marcos's father was arrested and killed for collaborating with the Japanese. And there's many reports that Marcos actually did the same during the war. Marcos actually wrote down and had historians write down that he was a war hero and he fought against the Japanese, but all accounts was he didn't. And the stories were he fought the Japanese, but winds up that the stories that were told were of a Filipina, a woman, who fought against the Japanese, and Marcos took all her stories and all the grand. And when Marcos became president, he wanted to change the country's name to Maharlika, which means butterfly, but it was the guerrilla outfit's name. So he wanted to honor the guerrilla outfit in World War II with names of the country after them. So Marcos was arrested after the war for running he was arrested for running a black market scheme, which he worked with the Japanese. But he said that he was selling goods to supply the guerrilla warfare. It wound up being not true, and the guerrillas actually put a hit on Marcos because he was collaborating with the Japanese. So Marcos always told stories of how he became wealthy, and he claimed that during the war he killed a troop of Japanese soldiers single-handedly with a bolo and a gun. A bolo is like a sword, a long machete, and he found gold and he hid it in a tree. And then he struggled the next 20 years trying to make money selling cars. And then he was elected to office in 1952. He actually had his case thrown out when he was in jail. He was given a pardon and refused the pardon and then fought it and then turned around and won and was released from jail. And then he claimed that in 1952, while he was in Congress or Senate, 2 Filipinos came to him to tell him that some Japanese individuals were mining for gold, offered to pay them to dig for gold bars, but when they found the gold bars, they refused to pay him. So Marcos got it with another friend of his and went over, killed the Japanese, and then brought the gold up. Then wound up killing the 2. There was 2 Filipinos actually there too, so there's 4 individuals there at the time. Killed all 4 of those people, and then the 2 witnesses that came forward, he wound up killing those, and then he killed a partner who came by to help him with the Japanese. And so Marcos took all that gold. There is a gold certificate from the 1950s where Marcos actually sold gold or owned gold. In 1965, Marcos used a lot of money and a lot of bribery and a lot of, bully tactics to become president. There is a rumor that Imelda's father, this is uncorroborated, is Santo Romano. There is a small, rumor on that, Pat. So in 1970, Imelda went to Cosmopolitan magazine and claimed that Ferdinand was the richest man in Asia. At the time, Marcos's salary was only $5,000 per year, so only $400 a month. And so a lot of people were like, yeah, all right. So when she said this, now all the other presses and media outlets all took notice of this, and they started mocking the Marcoses. And so Ferdinand actually had to go out and explain how they were so rich, and he said Yamashita's gold. And it winds up that no one's ever heard this, and he didn't make his money at that time on Yamashita's gold. It was probably from corruption and everything. In 1972, the Laurel-Langley Agreement ended. So several things happened. In 1972, the Laurel-Langley Agreement ended, and Marcos was going to be out of office. And the amount of money he was getting from corruption and kickbacks, he did not want to lose the power. So he made a fake assassination attempt on Juan Ponarelli. And then he used that as an excuse to declare martial law. And then he created a group known as the Rolex 12. During this time, the Laurel-Langley Agreement ended, and Marcos now took over for all the businesses in the Philippines, all the big businesses, and this is where the big money started rolling in. Right after this, 1971, or before this, 1971, Roger Rojas discovered the gold discovery in Baguio City. So when Bill Curtis met Marcos, Marcos only had 3 things he requested of Robert Curtis. He had to authenticate the maps that were owned by Ben Valmores to see if they were actually real. And he wanted to know if Ben Valmores and Giga were being honest about what they seen and their involvement in burying the treasures during World War II. According to Robert Curtis, they did find some treasure from like the ship Nanji and stuff like that. He wanted Robert Curtis to lead the Lieber group, and he needed Robert Curtis to build a refinery in the Philippines. Now, He offered Robert Curtis 1/11 of the share. So the Libra Group had 11 members. Each member received one share. How big one share was is another story. At this time, Marcos also took over because the Laurel Langley agreement deal ended. He took over all the mining industry in the Philippines. So all the gold that was mined in the Philippines, all the copper that was mined in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos got a vast majority of the money from it. Marcos needed to know how to launder money, all the gold, because he didn't want the foreign countries to say, where are you getting all this money from? How do you come up with $10 billion a year, $5 billion a year? He didn't want to flood the gold market with so much gold, because right now at 72, it was about $135 an ounce. Well, that would have been in 1975. But it was about $135 an ounce in 1975, a little bit lower. I think 120 about this time. And so he didn't want to ruin the market and have the gold be deflated. And he didn't want other countries to say, hey, this is our gold from World War II, we want it back. Robert Curtis went to the United States and talked to a bunch of senators and some executives that were involved in some shady business around the world with the mining cartels, we would call it, and some black operatives. And they claimed that they could mine like 1,000 metric tons of gold per month without it being suspicious. So they could actually take it, market it. So they could sell 1,000 tons a month and nobody would even notice, which is a lot. Marcos asked him to work on the ship Nachi with a Libra Group, and they scanned the ocean and they actually found it. And then they put a buoy on it, and by the time they were getting ready to go down and pick up the gold, Marcos changed his mind and didn't want them to do it because he didn't want to raise suspicion about it. And then he said, please go to Fort Santiago and look. When they started to look there, he changed his mind again. He says, oh, the people at the Historical Society don't want us doing renovations there because it might cause suspicion. Right at this point in time, Robert Curtis is running out of money, and he told General Ver, hey, look, I need to go back to the U.S. I need some money. And he was offered $5 an ounce to mine the gold in the Philippines, or smelt the gold, I should say. So they wanted to do another site in northern Philippines at the San Agustin Church. And again, Marcos said no, because the priests are a little bit shady and he doesn't want too many people knowing about it. So every time they find a site, Marcos would be like, no, let's not do it. And possibly what's going on here is Ferdinand Marcos actually never saw any of the maps. So basically what he could have been doing is he could have been like teasing them, like, okay, where do you want to mine? Okay, is this a place? Okay, let's go mine there. And when they're ready, oh no, let's go find it. Because he's probably trying to catfish them to tell them where the places are to mine or to locate. The next place they saw was a Teresa site. They dug for 2 months. Marcos let them dig there. And they found bombs and skeletons of over like 1,200 people. After this happened, Curtis was taken to the U.S. cemetery in Manila, and I believe this was on July 4th, 1978 or 77. He actually had a gun drawn on him and been threatened to kill, and he told him that he was going to die. And then he told Ver that we would help him find the 172 sites. And I think at this point in time, Marcos discovered that 172 sites. I don't think Marcos knew how many there were. He said that if he was dead, that Marcos could never find any of the treasures. So they made a phone call, and then they said, oh, okay, never mind, go ahead. Washington Post did an article saying that the U.S. citizens were actually in the Philippines looking for gold. And this is what really set Marcos off, because now he wanted to know who was leaking the story, and he thought Robert Curtis was leaking it. Robert Curtis says, no, it's not me. Robert Curtis says, it can't be any of my people that work for me in the Libra Group. He went back to his room, and his room was ransacked. They were looking for the maps. Marcos never had possession of the maps, never seen the maps. Robert Curtis had them hidden in his room somewhere. I don't know where he hid them, but they didn't find them. And so what he did was he took a Polaroid of them and a 35 millimeter camera shots of them. And then he burnt all the maps, 172 maps. And the next morning he left the Philippines. In 1976, a member of the Libra Group was in Vegas. One of the ambassadors that Marcos did not like, but was part of the Libra group. And Curtis went and talked to him, but he refused to talk to Curtis. So Curtis gave him a note to give to Marcos demanding his share of the money. And he said if he wasn't given the money that was owed to him for all the gold discovery, he was going to go to the press and tell everybody. And at this point in time, he said that Marcos found, and everybody else found, about $14 billion worth of gold. At this time, when Marcos went to the U.S. Senator and I believe the Birch Society and some of the other shady companies, he actually borrowed money from them. And because he came back to the States, he defaulted on those loans and he was sued for wire fraud. He pled guilty to this, but it winds up that he was just given probation. He wasn't given any jail time for it. Then Curtis found out that Ferdinand Marcos was actually put a hit on him from a Chicago mafia. So there was a hit out on Robert Curtis. So he's actually worried about it. So what he did was he started taping all his conversations. He's taping conversations he had with people. And this is where all the tapes are. And the tapes you heard is probably about the time when this was going down. Robert Curtis thought Marcos was going to kill him. So it was either going to be the Philippine government, it was going to be these shady organizations that were working for the U.S. government, the CIA, and then maybe the mafia. So he made all the tape conversations about everything he did, and even tape conversations with other Libra group members. In order to protect himself in case he died, he went to Senator Laxalt from Nevada. He gave him 32 hours of audio and video tapes, including conversations with players in Marco Plan, the Libra group, General Ver, Marcos. Any player he had a conversation he gave them to Laxalt. And he gave him over 1,000 pages of documents. And Laxalt said, go public with this story. And he went to this State Department and gave them, they said they were already aware of the whole situation. And then he decided to turn them all over to a Senate subcommittee searching into Marcos's. So this is where he went to the Las Vegas Sun, which I talked about last time, and told a story in 1978. And it was published in a series of posts, and it made huge news. I actually read the story in the Reader's Digest, but these stories have been out for a long time. And when this happened, Marcos denied everything. And then word got back to him, the hit from the mafia from Chicago was called off. Marcos wanted the heat off because now if Robert Curtis died right after saying this and he was shot, it would come back to Marcos. So Marcos never found out Curtis had the maps. What happened was he thought Curtis was going to give the maps to one of the generals that were helping the Libra group. Marcos never saw the maps. Ben Morris had them, and he gave them to Curtis. I was always wondering how Curtis got them, how Morris became involved with Marcos. Marcos offered $5 billion to Curtis to shut his mouth. Curtis agreed to it, and the gold was supposed to be sent to the United States. But instead, when the flight left left the Philippines, it was sent to Zurich and put into a vault. Curtis heard later on that just when he went to the press, Marcos opened up Hong Kong bank accounts to pay him the money that he owed him to shut him up. Marcos paid a lot of people to turn a blind eye, and he took advantage of a lot of people. But when he found out there were people that he could not take advantage of, he had to pay to shut him up. And Robert Curtis was one. He thought he could take advantage of Robert Curtis, but when Robert Curtis went public, he now had to pay Robert Curtis. Robert Curtis actually had a lot of people that came to him to ask him at this time to help them search for gold. One was Cooper, the astronaut, Dan Cooper, I think it was, who mapped the oceans and actually had a TV show about his mapping years ago. And what he did was he orbited the Earth, and while he was orbiting the Earth, he took pictures of the ocean force trying to locate ships. And Robert Curtis refused the offer to work on it. By this time, Congress passed a law called the Bolin Agreement, which said that the CIA had to ask Congress for money if they wanted to do covert operations, meaning that the CIA had to make public all their operations in order to top secret stuff. But if you want to do something top secret, you need to be very quiet. The press was really on it and said they wanted the CIA to say, we need $10 million to do a top secret investigation in Honduras or something. That's not very smart. Because of this, the CIA actually tried to make a deal with Corazon Aquino. They created a corporation called the Nippon Star. This was briefly talked about it last time. It was a corporation owned by the CIA, and they were searching for gold in order to obtain funds so they could do their top secret operations. Members of the Nippon Star came to meet Robert Curtis in 1987 and try to have him work with them because he had the maps and copies of the maps and he knew about them. And they wanted to have him help them locate gold. So he was worried that they might put a hit on him, so he flew to Hong Kong to meet with the executives. And this is where some of the tapes that you heard last year. And so the Nippon Star and him went to Corregidor to do an operation. They had permission, they had permits, but when they got there, they discovered that the permits were, even though they were signed on the presidential seal, they were signed by an individual who did not have authorization to allow them to search Corregidor Island. So at gunpoint, they were forced off the island. Robert Curtis believes that pretty much could be Nippon Star, the Birch Society, or one of these other top secret organizations were behind the CIA offering to hire him. The maps, the Nippon Star, without Robert Curtis, continued to search in the Philippines. So Robert Curtis got very ill and had to go to the hospital. He was supposed to go back to Vegas, but wound up, I believe, in San Francisco. He wound up getting ill and had to go to the hospital. At this time, Charles McDougald, the Green Beret, don't ask me how he finagled his way into the room, because I don't think there was even a connection at this time, came to the room and tried to talk to Robert Curtis over several days. Now McDougald, at this time, Curtis was almost in and out in a day, so he probably didn't even know who he was talking to. Winds up McDougald got a degree in the Philippines from the University of the Philippines, and he knew the president of the University of the Philippines. I think he got his doctorate. His thesis wound up being Ferdinand Marcos stole so much money out of the Philippines, and that's where he got his money. Charles McDougald knew the president of the University of the Philippines, which I believe had he knew political people in the Philippines. He worked with the government of the Philippines, and he talked Corazon Aquino into making a pact with Curtis to get him back to the Philippines to help them recover gold. So this would be the third time he came to the Philippines. During this time, he suggested to Charles McDougald to search, and reportedly, there was a cave-in. Now, this is the time I was in the Philippines. I actually was at Fort Santiago. I went as a tourist, and I saw a bunch of excavators and everything, and it was really torn up, and I really thought it was bizarre. Don't ask me why, but I asked someone, what are they doing? I mean, it was a construction site. They could have been doing renovations for all I knew, and the person said they're looking for Yamashita's gold. I never heard of Yamashita's gold at the time. And so I was like, wow. And at the same time, they had that movie, The Golden Buddha, starring Gretchen Barretto. And that's when I started to know about it and learned about it. There was a cave-in, and 2 people died. So the Philippine government at this time had to admit they were looking for gold. Charles McDougald said it was all Robert Curtis's fault. And he said that he used Curtis's testimony, I guess when he was in the hospital room, and Curtis's engineering maps. He said he gave him some engineering maps. Charles McDougald got off, but he already knew enough people in the politics in the Philippines where he could throw Curtis under the bus and get away with it. Curtis had to testify in front of the Philippine Senate to explain the cave-in, explain his responsibilities with Marcos, and how much knowledge he knew about it. And so after this, he decided he was going to leave the Philippines for good. But before leaving, he met with Giga and Ben Valmores. And Ben Valmores suggested that they go to a site in the Santa Maria Mountains. And this is where Ben Valmores revealed to Robert Curtis, I have 3 more maps. I have 3 more maps. He stashed away 3, making 175. This was throwing me off because I always thought there was 172, but then they kept saying 175, and I'm like, someone over-exaggerating, but Ben Morris had 3 extra maps. And so they went to a property, and this is where General Akira Tanaka died. It was called Little Tokyo. It was east of Manila, and there was a big battle for Manila. Curtis claimed that the landowner said that a group of Japanese had dug on the site earlier to try to make a shrine to General Tanaka. And in 1948, they looked at the site, and one of the sites that they were digging on, Curtis believed underneath it was some treasure. Morris said the gold bars that weighed 75 kilos, almost 200 pounds. So 75, 150 plus 34, 184 pounds each were inside. And after finding a helmet and a whistle, they went to the landowner and they said, look what we found. Well, the landowner was a drug addict and he had some serious issues. And he contacted his dealer to come and with guns, and they kicked everybody off the site. So Robert Curtis, and then he demanded that all their tools and equipment was going to belong to him. And so there wound up being a long battle lawsuit, like 3 or 4 months. Finally, the landowner had to go to rehab, and they were able to for it. Now, Robert Curtis also sued the Marcos administration after the Marcos went out, and I'm not sure if they settled. If they did, it was undisclosed amount. So, in general, basically, Ben Morris had the maps. He never gave them to Marcos. So Marcos never confiscated them. He gave them to Robert Curtis. Marcos wanted the maps badly. He was fishing them to try to find out where each site was. Locate the site. Okay, you located? Okay, we'll start digging. Oh, we won't dig here, we'll dig here. Now, Marcos went back and he would have people dig where they said while they were looking for the next site and the next site. He wanted to know where the sites were. So he didn't want them to dig. He just wanted to know where the sites were and claim that too much. He'd make an excuse so they wouldn't have to dig. And then Marcos would do that. So Marcos also took over the mining industry in 72, which means Marcos was sending gold to the smelters and having that smelted. But he also was selling this gold. All gold mined in the Philippines is supposed to be sold to the central bank. Marcos controlled the central bank. Marcos controlled the mining industry. So all the gold that was mined in the Philippines between 1974 to 1978, all was sold on the black market. Marcos took all that money. All gold that was sold to the central bank after 1978, Marcos could have sold with another decree without remorse or showing this Philippine Senate Congress how much was sold, and the central bank had to keep no records of it. So when it was all said and done, 7 tons of gold was missing from the Philippines, and 4 years of gold was never deposited. So we have up to 16, up to 23 tons of gold missing. But it could be even higher than that. Who knows? Because Marcos could have skimmed off the top 2, 3, 4 tons a year up until 86. So they say 72 to 86, 14 years, which is 66, 73 plus like 20 tons, 90. Marcos could have stole at least easily 100 tons of gold. Easily 100 tons of gold. Robert Curtis came and they showed him around the Philippines, showed him all the gold bars that there were. Now, Marcos could have played Robert Curtis into believing that they were 50,000 tons of gold, just to try to get him greedy and say, hey, look, yeah, there's 50,000 tons of gold. I can make some serious money. That's possible too. All right, thank you.